Yeah, unfortunately, the Seattle Kraken season is over. Just a little bit earlier than we would have liked it to be. Okay, yes, I know it was actually over like a week ago, but I needed to catch my breath for a little bit there, which I feel like is understandable. And either way, before we move on entirely from that season, let's look back on this fantastic second season that was. When all was said and done for the Kraken here in this second season, even if it did end a little bit earlier than we may have ideally chosen, it was still a great season that finished with a 46, 28, and 8 record for 100 points in the standings, which compared to their first season, and yes, we are going to be comparing to that first season a fair amount because one, it's relevant, and two, it really emphasizes just how great of a turnaround season this was. Well, it's good for 40 points more, a 66% increase there, and 19 more wins than the Kraken had in their first year. I mean, heck, it was such an improved second season for the Kraken that they nearly won as many games on the road, 26 here in the second year, as they did in the entire first season, 27 wins total there. And of course, as we all know, that 100-point season for the Kraken was enough to get them their first postseason appearance as the first wild card in the Western Conference and fourth in the Pacific Division. And then in the playoffs, well, they just continued this unexpectedly great season by knocking off the defending champs in 7 games and then pushing the Dallas Stars all the way to 7 in round 2. So again, while yes, the focus now does shift to the next season and what the Kraken can do to get those 9 more postseason wins to reach that ultimate goal, it is worth taking just that one more look back at this season and what made it so much better than the first year for the Kraken. And there are a lot of things that went into that. We talked about a number of them halfway through the season in that video, looking over what had made the Kraken so good to that point. But just by the numbers, probably the biggest one was the improved offense for the Kraken in this second year. Now, I'm well aware that the focus for many people on what the catalyst was for this Kraken team as to their improvement year over year is going to be the goaltending. But to me, it's not even close. It is clearly the offensive production of this team, where just when it comes down to goals, the Kraken had twice as many 20-goal scorers here in the second year, 6 to just 3 in their previous season, and even had one guy go all the way up to 40 in Jared McCann, who topped the team last year with 27. But honestly, looking at it from that individual player standpoint, I think it's even more impressive when you expand it out to point totals for the players, where last season the Kraken had 6 guys reach the 30-point mark, and once again, this year they more than doubled that with 13 guys getting 30 points or more, and 4 of them beating last year's record of 50 points set by McCann, which of course included McCann himself, who led the team once again with 70. And 2 of the other guys even managed to go over 60. So it should not come as a surprise whatsoever that when you look at things holistically as a team, the Kraken were a night and day completely different team and much better team in the offensive end. Where last season they ranked 29th in goals for per game, shots for per game, and expected goals as measured by Hockey Reference, as well as just 28th when it came to actual 5-on-5 goals. And of course, in year 2, they made big improvements in all 4 categories, but massive improvements in the 2 that mattered most, those being the 5-on-5 goals and just goals across the board in general. Where at 5-on-5, they were the best goal scoring team in the NHL, jumping all the way up from 28th to 1st from year 1 to year 2. And then just when it comes to goals scored per game in general, they nearly scored a goal more per game than they did in their first season. Good for a tie for 4th in the league. Again, jumping all the way up from that 29th rank in year 1. A big part of the reason for those struggles offensively, to say the least, in the inaugural season was that the only places that the Kraken managed to get more than the NHL average shots off from were up by the blue line, which honestly is bad in its own right. Those are really not the places you want to be taking shots off from. And if you are taking that many shots from up there, you definitely want to get some net front presence, which, well, as you can see from the big blue area in front of the net, they just were not able to do. Now in the second season, well, admittedly, the net front presence could still use some improvement. They were able to start getting the initial shots from much closer to the net, especially right up there in the high to mid slot and either face-off circle, pretty much the entire right side of that offensive end. They were able to really dominate that compared to the average NHL team. And while yes, there are still some red dots up there around the blue line, it's good to see the darker red areas move up closer to the net, and the Kraken not relying so much on just trying to get pucks through traffic from way, way outside. And then when it comes to the finishing ability between this year's team versus last year's, well, I think the finishing graphs kind of speak for themselves there. Now, it is fair to mention that some of the difference from one year to the next is the offensive additions that the Kraken made in the offseason, with especially Andrei Burakovsky, who, even though he only played just over half the season, did make a pretty big impact while he was there. The team still managed to produce pretty well offensively after he went down with injury, but still made a big difference while he was healthy, as well as Oliver Bjorkstrand, and of course, the full rookie season of Matty Beniers, and even on the defensive end, Justin Schultz adding to that as well. But even with all of those changes and improvements in personnel, probably the biggest difference in this noticeable improvement offensively was the offensive scheme of this team, where last year they pretty much just relied on winning forward checking battles after chipping it in from either the blue line if they could get it there, or honestly, more often than not, just past center ice. Now, the chip and win forecheck battle was definitely still a big part of this season's offense, and let's be honest, they were able to do it much better than they did in the inaugural season, but they were also able to mix in a good, healthy amount of just great transition play through the neutral zone, which wasn't really there last season, as well as taking advantage of rush chances and mistakes made defensively by the other team, which again, those opportunities seem few and far between last year, and even when they had them, they had a hard time actually making anything of them. Especially with the neutral zone play, where last year, the neutral zone was definitely a weakness for this team, and this year, the neutral zone transition from defense to offense was probably the biggest single difference that I would point to for this team from one year to the next, which was definitely helped out by, for one, having a real preseason and chance for guys to get to know each other coming into the season that because of COVID, they really didn't get going into that inaugural season. And then as a result of that, able to actually have consistent lines for pretty much the entire year, where last year, especially in the first half of the season, the lines were pretty much in a blender one game to the next, and even during games, it was hard to keep track of who was on whose line. Of course, however, no matter how much better a team is offensively, you don't make a 40-point jump in the standings without improving defensively as well, and the Kraken definitely were able to do that. Even if it doesn't show up quite as obviously in some of those stats that we have available to us as fans, we know that teams have more stats available to them, but at least when it comes to the ones we looked at offensively, the Kraken did make improvements, although they were still very good at limiting shots and thus expected goals last season, ranking fourth in both of those categories, jumping up to second this season. And thanks to a combination of better defense and better goaltending, which we'll get to here more in a second, they were able to limit opposing scoring to almost a half goal less per game. But at least to me anyway, with the stats that we have available to us, the biggest difference for the Kraken defensively this season over last then comes down to what I suppose you could call the eye test and actually having watched all of the Kraken games. And in that way, I suppose you could forgive national media and fans of other teams who aren't watching all, or let's be honest, even most of the Kraken games this season and especially last season, for then just looking at the slight improvements defensively statistically and then just going right to goaltending as the difference for the Kraken. But while in both seasons, even with a slight improvement, the Kraken were fantastic at limiting total shots on goal. Again, fourth in their first season and now second here in year two. Where those shots were coming from and how they were coming on net was massively different. Where in year one, it seemed like whoever was in net for the Kraken, it seemed to hardly matter whether it was Grubauer, Drieger, or Decord in a couple of instances. Whoever it was constantly getting left out to dry by the defense, and that includes the forwards on the back check, with mistakes being made either at the other end of the ice, neutral zone, or heck, even their own end of the ice, and allowing odd man rush after odd man rush after odd man rush down towards the Kraken end of the ice, and then forcing whoever the goaltender is, often Grubauer, to come up with some sort of big highlight reel save on a shot that's coming from a wide open player, and more times than not off of a pass off that odd man rush, or heck, maybe even a breakaway. Where this season, well, it happened occasionally. That's going to happen to every team. The Kraken defensively were able to limit those shots much more to the outside and really shut down those on-man rush opportunities for the most part. And that difference does show up a little bit here in the heat maps from the first year and this year, where the Kraken were allowing shots from in their defensive end. There's definitely some more red around the sides of the slot and those face-off circles in the first season, and then this year it's pretty much all blue in the defensive end, with the exception of a little red area there next to the net that you'd like to probably clean up, and then along the boards on the right side of the defensive end. And if shots are coming from there, then usually you're going to be able to make those saves for a goaltender. But again, regardless of where the shots were coming from, a bigger majority or a bigger percentage of those shots last season were coming from guys that were completely uncontested, either on a rush chance or just completely forgotten about by the defense in their end of the ice. Then with that player allowed to have all the time in the world to pick his spot and take that shot to give the goaltender less of a chance of making the save. Where this season, even with the Kraken doing a much better job of keeping shots to the outside and eliminating those rush chances, they were also doing a better job of going up and contesting any shots that opposing players were able to get off. And also a little bit better as far as blocking shots are concerned as well. The Kraken defensively just not allowing those high danger scoring chances as much, but also not allowing those players as much time and space in their end of the ice. Which, unfortunately for goaltenders in the NHL, and especially Grubauer last season, is not a difference that tends to show up when it comes to expected goals. At least the part about shots being contested or wide open anyway. Now, none of that is to say that the goaltending for the Kraken here in year 2 wasn't improved from year 1. It definitely was, especially for the guy who played good chunks of both seasons in Philip Grubauer. He definitely looked a lot more confident in net, and some of that, I think, does have to do with a more confident and more consistent defense in front of him. But it was also helped out by the fact that Martin Jones had a good start to the season and helped set up this team well for success when Grubauer did eventually take over about halfway through. Unfortunately for Jones, when it comes to save percentage, the not so great back half of the season does kind of drag that down for him. Grubauer does have an improvement, not quite up to 900 when it comes to save percentage, but still an improvement from last season. As a whole, though, goaltending, when it comes to save percentage, which isn't necessarily an all-encompassing or even the best stat available, it is the one most widely used, and the team save percentage for both seasons was exactly the same at a .890. Though it does come with an at least slight improvement in the second most popular stat, goals against average, where the Kraken improved there by .24, as well as adjusted goals against, again from Hockey Reference, one that I like a little bit better, but still no goalie stat is perfect, at least at the moment, as they do in some ways reflect the defense in front of the goaltender, which we can get more into the strengths and weaknesses of stats and advanced stats in hockey in a future video. But ultimately, it unfortunately does kind of leave us with the inexact science of, again, the eye test for seeing the differences in goaltending from one year to the other. And again, with Grubauer being the main Kraken goalie and the guy that we'll be seeing again next season as the main starter for this team, like I said, he did look much more confident in net this season, especially once he got his legs under him and consistently had that net with his injury issues early on in the first half. But also was doing a much better job, even outside of how he seemed to react to the defense in front of him, of when shots did come on goal and he made those saves, of limiting rebounds and also controlling where those rebounds went. This last season, honestly, I felt like he made a number of the first saves on a lot of those odd man rushes, but with either defense or guys being left open in the defensive end, or it being an odd man rush and defenders just not able to cover both players. Rebounds, he wasn't always able to control, and those did end up finding opposing sticks. And with Grubauer really attacking the puck a lot, which when you're able to prevent rebounds or control where they're going is a fantastic way to play it. If you're not able to control those rebounds or are letting rebounds up, it does pull the goaltender farther out of the net and then leaves that net much more open for a potential rebound chance. And that did bite Grubauer in the backside quite a bit more often last season, certainly than we saw this year. And besides, regardless of what the German gentleman did in the regular season, as we all know, he showed up and showed up big for this team in the postseason when it mattered most. And if you have to pick a best player for the Kraken in that postseason, I think most people are going to pick Grubauer for being the one that got the Kraken as far as they went in that first ever postseason run. And so all of that adds up to, once again, this massively improved, incredible second season for the Kraken at 5-on-5. But that still leaves special teams, which for the Kraken still leave something to be desired. Especially the power play, which although it did have a pretty noticeable improvement, a 5.2% improvement scoring versus last season, which brought it all the way up to 21st ranked, where last year it was 29th. It was still wildly inconsistent all year long, and even that improvement that it had was dragged up a bit by a strong start to the season and shaky finish, as well as not particularly great in the postseason. Penalty kill, I have to say, the stats on the season whole really don't tell the full picture and how I think we feel about this penalty kill going into next year, where although it was almost as bad, if not worse, than what it was last season, the 31st ranked at that, so one of the two worst penalty kills in the league last year, manages to somehow be ranked 21st on the whole with less than a 2% increase on the kills, so maybe that says something about the overall improvement of power plays across the league. But of course, as we know, for whatever reason, and there are actually good reasons for it, like a better scheme, the Kraken going for more of a box and aggressive approach more often than not, than the one guy back and then kind of wedge towards the top and then just being passive with that they were doing early on, as well as adding McCann to the kill certainly seemed to make a pretty big difference in the back half. Regardless of the reasons for the Kraken change halfway through the season, in early January, they just flipped a switch and like that went from one of the two worst penalty kills in the NHL and decidedly by a long way one of the two worst in the first half, to all of a sudden being one of the 5 best penalty kills in the second half of the season and the best penalty kill in the postseason, at least until they exited. So at least as far as that's concerned, it does give hope for next season that at least the penalty kill has gotten some things figured out, and it can be a pretty good one next year, where the power play, yeah, it's still going to need some tweaking to find consistency. At times, it seemed like they would have it figured out for a few games, or, I mean, heck, game 6 of that series against the Stars, this power play looked lethal at every time it touched the puck. But then as quickly as it came, it seemed like it would disappear. Game 7 and 5 on either end of that in that second series against the Stars, and really most of the playoffs, if we're being honest, power play was completely pointless for the Kraken and basically just wasted 2 minutes. The best they could hope for was that they would have possession going back to 5-on-5 and maintain momentum out of it. As for how the Kraken can make those improvements on the power play especially, as well as some other areas here and there, again, net front presence in the offensive end could still use some improvement. We'll cover that in a future video coming up. We got a couple more before we get there. So putting that aside for later, then with this team as a whole, again, it was just an absolutely incredible second season for the Kraken. Improvements all across the board. And again, even when it comes to just the eye test, this was a much more fun team to watch than the first season. Obviously, we enjoyed the first season, even in spite of the struggles the team had for what it was, being the first season of NHL hockey in Seattle. But it was good to see a team that was not only competitive night in, night out, but one of the top teams in the NHL, or top half teams anyway. They made the playoffs, and then was the 5th to last team playing, as they made it past every other team, or deeper into the second round than any other team that got knocked out. Obviously deeper than any of the teams that got knocked out in the first round, and the only 4 that made it farther are the 4 that are still playing as of when I'm recording this. And of course, I think it goes without saying that this team massively outplayed the expectations that anybody had for them, not just in the regular season coming in, but as well the postseason once they made it there. And that even includes the people that put this team together, as in the postseason press conference, Ron Francis even said that while going into the season, he was saying all the right things about how they were trying to compete for a playoff spot and be a much better team than they were last season, that you never expect a 40-point increase from one season to the next. So again, this team even outplaying what the people that put it together thought they could do. As for what that means for expectations going into next season, well, it's safe to say they'll definitely be higher than they were coming into this year. And while I don't necessarily think it's realistic to expect a conference final and the team going farther than they did this season, I think saying that we expect playoffs is pretty fair, especially given what this team was able to do and hopefully making some improvements in the offseason. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. And so with that in mind, I'd love to hear what you guys think down in the comment section below, what your favorite parts of this season were, if there's anything you felt that I left out of this that I should have included as far as what went well for the Kraken in this season, maybe a favorite game or a favorite moment for the season. For me, some ones that would obviously stick out, probably the most obvious one is the Game 7 win over the Avalanche, or maybe the Game 4 overtime win with Eberle's goal at home. For that matter, the Game 1 win of Gord's overtime win on the road in the second round. There's all sorts of games in the regular season as well. Beniers ending it 7 seconds into overtime against the Capitals comes to mind. Obviously, winning in Boston and being the first team to hand them a regulation loss at home. That coming in January, so it had been quite a while that they had gone without that happening. That being a part of the record-setting sweep of a 7-game road trip. And then part of that winning streak being the record-setting for fastest 5 goals in a game against Chicago, where they put up 8 in that one and 5 in less than 4 minutes, I think it was. So for the Kraken, all sorts of great records, whether it's franchise records or NHL records, set in this second season. Again, like I said, the best second season for any franchise ever, and hopefully they can just build on that going on into the future. And if they're able to keep building on it with record season after record season, it won't be too long before they're bringing back cup after cup, though I might be getting a bit ahead of ourselves, but it has been a fun year for the Kraken. But with that, and again, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section. We will close it out for this one. So if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. And until next time, and we still do have a few more videos here for the off season before we start getting to some more fun stuff and some 101s. We'll have up next will be player grades, then we'll have Kraken player awards, and then a look at what I expect to change here in the off season, and probably even a separate one for what the farm system is looking like for the Kraken. Obviously, that will wait until after the Coachella Valley Firebirds finish their playoff run, as they're still looking to win the Calder Cup, which is different than the Calder Award that Matty Beniers is likely to win. Different thing, the AHL Championship there, the Firebirds are still in the running for that. Obviously, congratulations, while we're talking about it, to the Seattle Thunderbirds, who won the WHL and now go for the Memorial Cup. That's the overall CHL Juniors title. So lots of exciting things happening in Seattle hockey, even with the Kraken season having come to an end. That having been said, again, thank you very much for reaching this point. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below. Help support the channel, so I appreciate you using them. As always, stay safe out there, be good to each other. God bless, and go Kraken!